Hello everyone, my name is Jalen Stevens and I'll be your tour guide today as you discover Hot Springs, Arkansas. So we're gonna go over a lot of things talking about Hot Springs today, including past, present, and future of Hot Springs. So I'm excited to get to know all of you and help you get to know Hot Springs, Arkansas. So one thing we need to look at is definitely the history of Hot Springs, Arkansas and how everything came to be. It's a really cool place and it's cool to know the history. Before it was ever officially claimed, it was used by Native Americans. They would just pass through. They didn't really settle there ever, but they passed through and they used these thermal springs as a way to use their healing properties that they had. So it was very common for that, but it was never officially settled by any Native American tribes. Then in 1673, Father Marquette from France claimed the land for France, and then over the next many years, France and Spain kind of battled it out, and they had it went back and forth from each of their countries, like land. But then in 1803, with the Louisiana Purchase, it was officially the United States. Dr. George Hunter was the first person from the States to explore. So he was the first explorer and he got to discover the hot springs in a whole different way. And then in 1807, a few years later, were the first modern settlers. And it started out with one man, but slowly over time, people started to trickle in just because it's a beautiful place and people wanted to live here. And then in 1832, the Hot Springs Preservation was created by the United States government. And what that did was it granted federal protection of the land. So it was renamed the Hot Springs National Park in 1921, and there was federal protection over the land. So when Hot Springs, Arkansas started to rebuild after the American Civil War, they immediately got to work on building bathhouses and hotels, and they really tried to make it better than it was before. The year-round population actually soared to 1,200 people in the year 1870. So things were looking up for Hot Springs. There were 6 bathhouses and 24 hotels and boarding houses that were just right around the springs. Then Joseph Reynolds decided that it would be a great idea to build a narrow gauge railroad into Hot Springs, and this made people visiting Hot Springs, that made that number soar. And so because of this, a man named Samuel Force decided that he wanted to build the first luxury hotel in the area, which is known as the Arlington Hotel, which opened in 1875, which is a hotel that has lots of history in Hot Springs. One interesting story about the Arlington Hotel, it was actually used by American gangster and crime lord Al Capone, and historians say that he rented out the whole fourth floor of the Arlington Hotel when he stayed at Hot Springs, Arkansas. And then there is a legend that the room that he personally stayed in has been locked and is not currently available to anyone. So that's just a fun little story. Speaking of crime, Hot Springs, Arkansas does have a history of crime and illegal gambling and gangster activity in the town. The following decades after the Civil War in the 1880s, there were actually 2 factions, and it was the Flynns and the Dorans. And they had a rivalry, and they both wanted control of the town. It's a known fact that Frank Flynn, who is the leader of the Flynn faction, actually paid local law enforcement in the area to not only collect unpaid debts, but to help scare the Doran faction. So he used local law enforcement against them. At this point, Hot Springs became a sort of mecca for illegal gambling, and there were hotels that would advertise the use of prostitutes, and also off track booking for any horse race in North America. It was a huge deal for people who lived there and for people who were just coming through and visiting. And it wasn't until 1967 that gambling there someone put a stop to the illegal gambling that was going on, because the government of Hot Springs, they kind of turned a blind eye to it while it was happening, just because of the attraction that it was to Hot Springs. But in 1967, two Republican office holders sent a company of state troopers in to shut down all of the casinos and burn all of their gaming equipment. There was only a few places that you could gamble in Hot Springs until later, when more gambling places became available. But there was the Southland Gray Dog Park track, and that was one of the places you could gamble, in a thoroughbred horse racing track called Oakland Park. So those are still remaining in business today. On September 5th, 1913, a fire broke out in Hot Springs. The cause of the fire is unknown, but it did do a lot of damage. It started just a few blocks away from the Army and Navy hospitals that Hot Springs had, but in the beginning, the fire went southeast, which was away from the city. But about an hour later, the wind switched up and turned it around, and it started to come back towards the city. Now, while it was coming back towards the city, it was taking out houses, businesses. Over 100 businesses were taken out by this fire. It also destroyed the public works utility plant, which meant that the firefighters had no water to put this fire out. So as it's going downtown, the firefighters in Hot Springs were also working with Little Rock firefighters, who took a special train down, and they are trying to put this fire out. The fire did eventually go out because of a rainstorm that came, but the devastation was terrible and the town had to rebuild. A fun fact about the history of Hot Springs, Arkansas, is that it also is referred to sometimes as the birthplace of spring training baseball. During the early 20th century, it was known for having lots of baseball camps. It first started to welcome Major League Baseball in 1886, when the now Chicago Cubs took their coaches and players down to Hot Springs, and they used it for preparation for the upcoming season and had baseball camps. It's said during the early days of this football training experience that these celebrities had, you could see many famous baseball players, including players like Babe Ruth, just walking around the streets of Hot Springs, going to visit those thermal baths, gambling at the horse tracks. They were seen all the time. Now, because Hot Springs has such a historic baseball history, there is a place I recommend you go visit while you are visiting Hot Springs, and that's the Historic Baseball Trail. There are 26 green plaques and markers all on the trail that have different fun facts and information all about the history of baseball that I definitely recommend. Hot Springs, Arkansas, of course, got its name from the thermal water that's flowing through it. Hot springs are actually natural hot water, and they get heated from subterranean volcanic activity. Most hot springs are accessible and you're able to go swimming in it because it's not heated to a temperature that's high enough, although some are heated to a temperature that is too high. But the pools in Hot Springs, Arkansas, of course, are loved by many visitors. I want to thank you for listening and letting me share my knowledge of hot springs with you. I hope you enjoyed it and that you come and visit and explore the wonders of hot springs and get to experience all of the history that we talked about today. Thank you. Bye.